welcome Rebecca Epworth. Rebecca comes from an environmental engineering background with extensive consulting experience in urban water management and hydrological assessments. Rebecca is no stranger to presentations at these nights. She has over 16 years of experience and provides expert advice to large-scale residential, commercial and industrial developments, as well as extractive resource projects in WA. Rebecca is also the chairperson of the UBIA Urban Water Committee and a previous councillor. She's chairperson and sits on the board of New Waterways and is secretary of the Stormwater Industry Association. She sits on various other technical advisory groups and water steering groups for industry and government, advising on and contributing to relevant guidelines and legislation, placing her at the forefront of developments in water planning. Rebecca is also a key representative on our stakeholder reference group for our policy review program, so she's a constant source of information. And over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah. Okay, yeah, just a bit of a background about sort of how this came about is I recently returned from a big sort of long service trip, primarily to South America. So the examples I'll take you through is drainage in Buenos Aires, the Wadjuk system in Oman, Tunisia, and then Inca, and also some pre-Inca stuff in Peru. So this is El Zañón, which is a mansion in Buenos Aires. It's in an area of San Telmo, which was a really rich area. And in 1985, they were restoring this mansion, and they came across these tunnels, which they previously didn't know about. They're about 2 kilometers long. And what it turned out it was that the San Telmo area was a swampland, and the residents actually, they dug out the natural watercourses. They dug out and they sort of defined the channel a bit more and then built the houses over the top. But it was on a resident approach, so it was a really piecemeal approach. So that's why there was only sort of 2 kilometres of it. And these, they went back afterwards, and originally they just sort of dug out into the natural geology, but then they actually went back with when they had erosion issues and lined it with bricks. It was primarily a sort of flooding issue that they were dealing with on a sort of vaguely, personal level, I guess. But they were dealing with issues where there were confluence from different watercourses that they were dealing with in their land and then putting under their mansion. As you can see, like the tunnels were absolutely huge. The floor here is part of the restoration, so obviously it wasn't there, but you can see that where they identified the confluence. The tunnel system was from 1780, but what was, these are a couple of the mansions in San Telmo, what was quite interesting is about 100 years later, they had a huge yellow fever and cholera epidemic. They lost 14,000 people in the space of 3 months, which was about 10% of the population, and then the rest of the population just evacuated and left all of these mansions that they built and just got out of there. The cholera and yellow fever was as a result of terrible water supply systems and the wastewater, human and industrial, just sitting in ditches, and then the mosquitoes coming in and bringing the yellow fever. Now, it's like that was 100 years afterwards. It's a prime example of how the piecemeal approach they did with the individual residents looking at their drainage situation, but they didn't do it across the whole of San Telmo. So it wasn't until after the epidemic that they actually decided to do a all-encompassing sort of master plan for the San Telmo area, where they looked at the drainage and they separated the drainage and the sewage and had a system. And since then, they obviously then didn't have interesting as well in the mansions is that they have these rainwater tanks that they kept in the basements, and they would funnel water through the entire mansion, as you can see there, down into the cistern, so they could have their clean water supply. So the flage system, I've also just noticed that I then spelled it incorrectly on the next line. But 80% of Oman is a desert, so it relies heavily on their water supply. Flage means split into parts. So it's a way of doing fair and equitable water dispersal. So this is a flage system. So the water source would come from a groundwater source, and then they would disperse it through these channels to farms for household water supply, but also irrigation. Now, interestingly, when it was first set up, it was on like a first come, first served basis, how we do it, you know, at DWER nowadays. And they each sort of orifice to the farms, it would be restricted by the orifice coming off these main channels. And so everyone, the people closest to the wadi or the groundwater would get the first water, and then subsequently, you know, it would go to people further out. Nowadays, these systems are still, sorry, I forgot to say that, these are dating back to 500 AD. So there's 3,000 still in Oman, and they're still operational, they still use them. So nowadays, because of the declining water resource, the first come, first served basis didn't work so well anymore. So they actually have water agents now, and they stopper all of the outlets, and they go along, and a water agent will release sort of the outlets for a period of time to allow that water into, you know, Joe Bloggs' land. And they have watchtowers along the flage system to ensure that people don't just open the gates without permission. It's quite amazing. So Tunisia, this is the Fagara system. So this is a very similar system. It's quite prevalent across North Africa and the Middle East system, and it's thought that it was originated in Iran or Persia around the first millennium BC. So it's hugely old. The term for this system, in each different country they've got different dialects for what they call it, but the sort of general term is the Qanat water supply. So with these mountainous areas, they would have these underground channels that would intercept the aquifer, and then via gravity, all of these would be fed via gravity. Now in these dry, arid landscapes, it was in their best interest to keep these channels underground because of the evaporation losses. The other, so the groundwater supply is obviously more reliable and continuous, and it's so the sort of preferred mechanism, but they also maximised all of their sort of harvesting potential. And this is taken, so this was an ancient village that was next to a wadi. So a wadi is like a dry riverbed most of the year, except in extreme events. We were actually lucky enough to be there for an extreme event, and this photo is taken at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and that light is lightning. So it just completely, unlike anything I've ever seen, the entire landscape was bright red. So I was obviously very excited and basically spent the entire night outside watching the wadi. But what they do is, so this is the next, in the morning, and you can see the flows obviously increased. But what they do is divert some of the water where possible. So this example is quite rudimentary, and then you can see they've sort of put in a bit of a block to try and get some into the date farm there. But in other examples, what they do is they put in weirs and stone wall diversions that were a bit more permanent to try and divert some of that water in. so moving on to Peru and the Incans. Now, the Incans were just absolutely brilliant and fascinating. Their terraced farming is really something which is quite astounding given the time. So the Incans are around 1400 AD. Now, with the terraced farming, you might look at that and think, A, why didn't you just find some flat land and build on it, like it's 1400s, there's plenty of land. Or B, you know, that they dug into the land. You know, that's a sort of immediate assumption. But this is what's amazing. They didn't actually dig into the land. They had the, you know, largely sort of impermeable hillside, and what they did is they built these walls up on the side, and the geology wasn't great for farming, so they built it up, and then they added the soils into these tiers. Now, looking at that photo, looks fairly familiar, yeah?
Perfect back, Doctor.
Yeah. So again, when that photo was taken when I was going around, and one of these guys showed that booklet, and again, I just got incredibly excited because I was like, oh my god, it's like a biofilter! I mean, so they had the, you know, the rich soils at the top, and then the progressively coarser sands and gravels going through the layers. At the bottom of their crop beds, they had a drainage pipe going through the water, so they also didn't waste any water. Anything that got through then went down onto the next tier. I mean, it's obviously they weren't designing it for stormwater treatment processes, but you know, there's the draining and growing of plants. So this is another example of it. Now, the other fascinating thing about this was what it did for the actual farming. So these walls heated up, and so it allowed them to grow crops, primarily coca, which they were using for sort of energy and altitude sickness, which is now for cocaine. Woo! So previously they could only grow coca up to 1,500 meters above sea level. This enabled them to grow it up to 3,000 meters above sea level. So it opened up huge areas that they could farm in. You can also see the sort of where the drainage scouring effects go down. Oh, this one isn't particularly water related, but I just found it fascinating, and the planners or any landscapers might find it quite interesting, is that the way they sort of did everything, you know, there was such consideration to everything they did. These tiers, they segregated their tiers, and you notice the 3 tiers at the top, they've got the bigger stones, it's a lot smoother, a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Those ones were for ornamental plants. And it's because at the top there were the temples. So to honour the gods, they had the very nice stone-fronted walls, and they brought these stones, these huge stones from like across the valley to get them there. So it was a huge effort, and then they had all these ornamental plants. But you'll notice the bottom one, it's just a lot of the smaller local rocks, which they use for agriculture purposes. So it was really about, you know, the sort of practicality. So the water management side of things. This is really, so we've got the water supply, similar to the Quinat systems in that they got the water supply from groundwater and springs, and then channeled it down. And on the left-hand photo, that's the fountains where people would go collect their water. And so anything that the collection point through there would then go on to the next fountain. So through like Machu Picchu, for example, they would have several of these fountains, and you'd go to fill up your pots from these water fountains. The Inca obviously got it directed straight into his house. So it went to him first, and then it went on to these water fountains. But what was also quite incredible is that this system they designed with largely, impermeable. They got huge slabs of rock so that they were more impermeable, and they lost less water due to leakage. Which, considering like Thames water today, still loses something ridiculous like 20% of their water due to leakages. These guys were like, well, if we build the impermeable layer with bricks, we're going to lose a lot more water. So, really quite astounding. But the other thing is that they separated their drainage and water supply systems. Now, that photo on the right actually isn't in Machu Picchu or Ollantaytambo, but because a lot of their drainage system they also put under pavement, so it wasn't so good for photo opportunities. But, when you think back to, the plague and cholera in London, 500 years after this, and they didn't realise the importance of directing wastewater and stormwater away from where people were living. And then you look back at these guys who, realise the importance of having separate water supply and separate, water disposal systems. It's when you talk about sort of the lost Incas, you kind of sit there going, God, it really, the greatest travesty is that, their knowledge and brilliance was lost. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure I didn't miss any key things over there. Oh, so the Nazca aqueducts. So this is actually pre-Incan, and it's around the 5th century. This system is a prime example of when we talk about, how water planning should be on a case-by-case basis, and we need to look at the site constraints and we need to adapt. This system is actually very similar to the sort of Quanut systems where the right on time then. Where the Quanut systems, we're getting water from the mountainous areas, but this one is in a delta, so they couldn't gravity feed it as much as some of the other areas like Tunisia and Oman. So those, I hope there's no one Spanish in the room because I'm about to say ojos, which means eyes in Spanish, which is what they're calling those sort of chimney type things, funnels. They were designed, they had a couple of reasons. Basically, they're like ancient manholes. So they were maintenance and make sure could stop the clogging and to get water if you're not getting it from the end point. But also the wind would swirl through that chimney function and then create differences in atmospheric pressure and push that water through the drain. To aid before we had pumps. Which, this was, we're talking, 1,500 years ago. It's just amazing. So this brings me, this is a bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek end slide, in that talking about all of the ancient civilisations and how amazingly they dealt with stuff. Considering, the advance they had. We were living in Coterra a couple of years back, and, obviously, Qatar was a nomadic village until like the 1930s when they discovered oil, and then it just popped out of nowhere. And obviously, their building and construction is beautiful and astounding, but they only have 0 to 300 mils of water, of rainfall a year. So drainage is obviously not one of their priorities. While we were there, they had a 10 mil event, and one of the main areas flooded and basically brought the city to a standstill. They launched an investigative panel to understand why this happened, and they determined that I've highlighted there that it was because of the absence of an outlet to the drainage channels. And my favourite bit though is that how to rectify this situation. The panel suggested that they get an emergency system, crisis management, and improved coordination between the relevant authorities, and also monitor when there's water in the water system. So, you know, it's just, we were talking earlier before the talk about, you know, how, you know, back then when there wasn't so much sort of concern about liability and, you know, if you're going to do something and then there's repercussions afterwards, you know, there was a lot more scope for sort of, you know, innovation and trying and then getting stuff done, you know, and then, you know, nowadays it's like, I think probably the Qatari ancestors would turn their grave finding out that they built a drainage system with no discharge point. So, there you go.